Dr. Eberhardt and believe his book to be very material, counsel.
Don't antagonize them.
The witness will continue.
One night, after listening to a prize fight on the radio, a contest in which Joe Louis wrested the heavyweight championship from one James Braddock, Jadway told friends who had been listening to it with him that love between a man and a woman was most often performed like a prize fight. When Jadway was asked to give examples of books that depicted the more common hostile love, he cited Henry Miller's Tropic of Capricorn, which he had just read, as a book that reflected the brutality of love.
One of your witnesses, Elmo, has got to be a thinking man's faggot. Those queens are so afraid of anything straight, they're bound to be on our side.
Throughout the 7 minutes is an act of hatred against womanhood. Jadway has unconsciously taken on the role of a pugilist, attempting to down and humiliate the opposite sex. End quote. I find myself in total agreement with Dr. Eberhardt.
How much did we offer to pay him to testify?
Transportation plus 5 big ones.
Please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
State your name for the record.
My name is Christian Leroux.
Please be seated.
I wonder how much he got from the DA.
You better believe it wasn't chopped liver.
Mr. LaRue, what is your present occupation?
I'm a publisher of books.
When did you first become a publisher?
In 1933, my father died, leaving me a very modest inheritance. So I established my own publishing house, the Étoile Presse.
Is this the same publisher that brought out a work of fiction in 1935 entitled The 7 Minutes by J.J. Jadway?
The same.
Mr. LaRue, I have seen your original version of this book, which was printed in English. Since it was published in Paris, why was it not in the French language?
The French government wouldn't permit its publication in French.
Why not?
The censorship bureau declared it was obscene.
Obscene. To your knowledge, has the 7 Minutes ever been published in any other country, in any other language?
Oh, no. Absolutely no nation in the world would pass on it or even accept it. Literary critics in many countries regarded it as the most depraved book ever published in the history of literature.
Your Honor, I object to Mr. LaRue's self-serving answer, and I ask that it be stricken on the grounds that it is incompetent.
I think that the witness is qualified to give that answer. Motion to strike is denied and objection overruled. Proceed, Mr. Duncan.
Mr. LaRue, what kind of commercial success did the 7 Minutes have in France?
Well, not as much as we'd hoped. My initial printing was 5,000 copies. This sold out in a year. Then I ordered a press run of another 5,000 copies. But the sales slowed down and eventually stopped. That is after the Vatican placed the book on the index.
Father Sarfati, you testified that the Curia offices have been revamped and streamlined since J.J. Jadway's book was first published in 1935.
Yes, in 1966, in keeping with the new ecumenical council spirit which pervaded the church and all of Christendom, Pope Paul VII abolished the title of the Supreme Congregation of the Holy Office because it had long been held offensive by Protestants who associated it with what they regarded as persecution in early church history.
Is it not true, Father, that at the convening of the Ecumenical Council, there were numerous Roman Catholic clerics who protested against the old Holy Office, the very office that condemned Jadway, because it did not hold fair hearings for authors?
The Catholic Church is a democratic body. Its bishops and cardinals are given total freedom in the formation of their opinion. There were those who chose to express some measure of disagreement with the rulings of the Holy Office.
Would it not follow then, Father, that in view of the new liberality on the part of the Church, that what the Church condemned and prohibited in 1935, it might not condemn and prohibit today?
Signore, sir, that is a hypothetical question which I have neither the qualifications nor the authority to answer. Let me say this, however, that I am here before you as a representative of the Vatican because the Church is just as concerned today as it was in 1935 about the publication and circulation of an immoral and sacrilegious work of fiction entitled The 7 Minutes.
You got it now, Harvey? I want you to hit them with as many numbers as possible. Make it sound like this dame is second cousin to every one of those clowns in that jury box.
Our average woman resides in an urban area, a city of less than 100,000 population, which qualifies Oakwood to supply this woman. She has a 5-room home worth $11,000. Half the house is mortgaged. The house has a bathtub or shower, flush toilet, electricity, 1 telephone, 1 TV set, and a washing machine. No air conditioning, no clothes dryer, no food freezer. The average woman spends 7 hours a day in the kitchen performing her household chores.
Very impressive, Mr. Underwood. You've covered everything except her frequency of elimination and the time of day she prefers to fornicate.
Let us observe some of the rules of taste, Counselor. And would you please refrain from turning your back to the court?
Forgive me, Your Honor, but I feel the court should be a little more enlightened about the average person, especially in relationship to statistics. Now, as I understand it, 51% of the population of the United States is female, while 49% is male. Now, according to what you've said, that means the average American is only female. Now, is that true?
Of course not. One can't average 2 absolutes. I was referring to concepts that can be converted into statistics, such as age or income.
Oh, I appreciate you wanting to talk about numbers, Mr. Underwood, but I want to talk about persons. Specifically, the average person mentioned in the criminal code. Let me ask the jury this. Supposing 50% of the American population was male and 50% was female, wouldn't the average American be a queer?
Now that we've established your qualifications as an average housewife to the court's satisfaction, Mrs. White, can you tell us whether you read a novel called The 7 Minutes, written by J.J. Jadway?
I have. I forced myself to read it from cover to cover.
As an average person in your community, applying contemporary standards, what was your reaction to this book?
I found it sickeningly obscene.
Did you feel it went beyond the customary limits of candor in its description of nudity or sex?
The 7 Minutes belongs in the garbage disposal. If I had one, that's where the book would go.
Did you find anything in the novel that could be considered as having social redeeming importance?
It was sex and more sex, and nothing else. I never laid eyes on reading matter more obscene.
Thank you, Mrs. White. Your witness, Counselor.
Mrs. White, since you are the first average woman I've ever met, I'm eager to know a little more about your taste. I'm anxious to know if your reading habits are also average.
They are.
Oh. How do you know they are?
I read a lot. All the popular things that come into the library. And in paperback.
Have you ever read Peyton Place by Grace Metalius?
Of course not.
Have you read God's Little Acre by Erskine Caldwell?
No, I haven't.
Have you read Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence?
I have not.
Have you read In His Steps by Charles Sheldon?
No. I never even heard of it.
That's very interesting, Mrs. White. Then by Mr. Underwood's standards, your reading habits are far from average. You see, the 4 novels I've just mentioned have sold over 30 million copies in this country alone.
To which I object, Your Honor. The counsel is badgering the witness in front of the jury and is asking questions in argumentative form. I know 20 books that outsold the novels Barrett mentioned.
Those are 4 of the 5 all-time leading bestsellers in American history.
Gentlemen, let's proceed in an orderly fashion. I expect both of you to abide by the rules of evidence. Now let's get on with the trial.
Mrs. White, would the average American read the 7 Minutes?
Absolutely not.
But you're supposedly average. And you read it, didn't you?
I was requested to read it for this trial.
Oh, otherwise, you would not have read it.
Most certainly not. I don't waste my time with obscene reading.
But, Mrs. White, how would you know it was obscene if you didn't read it?
I don't have to drink poison to know that it's poison.
Do you believe that writers should say what they mean when writing about sex?
Yes. But they can do that without using indecent words, like the words in that book.
Can you be specific about the words in the 7 Minutes that offended you?
Well, I'm certainly not going to use them.
Point them out. Let me see what you object to. Go ahead. The book won't bite.
Very fine, Mrs. White. I appreciate your cooperation. Now, what we have here is the word fucking.
Is that correct? Excuse me, Mrs. White. That is the word you object to.
Disgusting.
Would you have been happier if the writer had used such euphemisms as they slept together, they were intimate, or they made love?
I would have understood just as well what the author was trying to say.
But you could have been wrong. If Kathleen and her man had slept together, were intimate, or they made love, they might have been doing many other things other than the only exact word for this particular act. It cannot be mistaken. Mrs. White, I'm not advocating that coarse or vulgar words should be used by everyone everywhere. I am saying that writers from Chaucer to Jadway should be allowed and permitted the freedom to use specific, precise words when writing realistically. Now, wouldn't you agree, Mrs. White?
I am not interested in the past, Mr. Barrett. I'm interested in protecting our morality in the present, especially the morality of our young people, so that our civilization doesn't decay and decline the way others have done.
Thank you.
Remember that part of Van Fleet's testimony when he mentioned the anecdote about the night Jadway was listening to Joe Louis win the heavyweight title by knocking out Braddock?
Yeah.
When did Jadway die?
February 1937.
Correct. Jadway killed himself and was promptly cremated in February 1937. But here we have Dr. Eberhard telling us how Jadway read and discussed Tropic of Capricorn. Capricorn wasn't published until 1939.
Well, maybe Dr. Eberhard confused his source of information. We confused Tropic of Capricorn with Tropic of Cancer, which I'm damn well sure was published while Jadway was still very much alive.
No, listen to this. Page 624. Joe Louis knocked out Jim Braddock in the 8th round in Chicago in June 1937. Get it? June 1937. That means that Jadway was listening to the fight 4 months after he was supposed to be dead. Now, how does that grab you?
A lot better.
The distinguished Dr. Eberhard may have been wrong a second time, but twice in one paragraph from a renowned scholar. Highly unlikely. This gives us a new and revived Jadway, who did not die in February 1937, as LaRue and the priest testified. It gives us Jadway very much alive 4 months later. For that matter, is he even dead?
Clay, we're back in business. You handle the cross-examination tomorrow? If I answer, I can catch the late flight to New York. Eberhard could save our necks.
The mistake could have been made only by my source.
Dr. Eberhard, but I was unaware that there was any source involved, other than yourself. You see, I assumed that you were present when Jadway made way.
No, I was not. My confidential source was one of Jadway's closest friends in Paris in the 1930s.
Who was he?
Well, considering how I was misled, I see no reason not to reveal his name. I acquired the information from a poet named Shauna Flanagan.
My name's Michael Barrett. May I sit down?
Depends.
Could I buy you a drink?
Grab a chair. Dennis, a flagon of your best brandy with a water back. What can I do for you, young man?
Well, sir, I'm the lawyer defending the reputation of your old friend, J.J. Jadway.
Oh, yes, the 7 minutes.
Dr. Hiram Eberhard led me to believe that you were one of Jadway's closest friends.
Correct, young man. That's precisely why I won't discuss the subject.
Keep the change.
Thank you.
But on the contrary, Mr. O'Flanagan, the censors won't let him rest. If I could only find out when Jadway died and how.
Suicide. Jumped into the Grand Canal, the poor wretched soul. Drowned.
When was that?
Allow me. Year of our Lord, 1937, Anno Domini, amen.
Then there appears to be a slight contradiction in testimony concerning the date of Jadway's death, based on the material that you supplied, Dr. Eberhard.
Eberhard put it down wrong. I didn't hear him right.
He taped the interview with you.
I guess I screwed up my dates and time.
I remember Jadway's death as if it were yesterday. It was in all the papers. Hurled himself from a 6-story apartment building in San Francisco.
A minute ago, you had him drowning in the Grand Canal.
Did I know?
Isn't it possible you could have made a mistake about the date of Jadway's death? Maybe he died in 1939 or 40, instead of 1937.
That's not possible. Jadway was alive long after that. Enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Made mincemeat of the Kaiser.
The Kaiser.